Hello everyone and welcome to the channel The Territory of Cinema. Please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button if you enjoy our content. Today, we are going to be discussing the film Until Dawn 2025. The air in the remote Blackwood Pines Lodge hung thick with the unspoken tension of a year's worth of grief and fractured friendships. 8 college friends, a group bound by shared history, and now by the chilling anniversary of the tragedy that claimed 2 of their own, convened for what was meant to be a reunion, a forced attempt at closure. There was Sam, practical and grounded, still wrestling with the loss of her close friend, Hannah. Beside her, Mike, ever the confident jock whose bravado often masked deeper insecurities, tried to steer the mood toward celebration, a habit ingrained from years of competitive drive. The group dynamic was a delicate ecosystem. Josh, the brooding architect in training whose mental state had visibly deteriorated since the incident on the mountain, was clearly the most fragile. His sister, Beth, whose absence was the gaping wound in their collective memory, weighed heavily on everyone. Emily, sharp-witted and aspiring documentarian, saw the entire weekend as potential material, her camera always ready, a modern-day chronicler hungry for drama. Her boyfriend, Chris, the earnest, slightly anxious literature major, preferred thoughtful conversation over manufactured excitement, often looking to Emily for reassurance. Rounding out the quartet were Ashley, the quiet observer often lost in her own thoughts, and Matt, the loyal, if somewhat peripheral, member of the inner circle. Their arrival at the seemingly luxurious but isolated mountain retreat was immediately undercut by a palpable sense of unease. The mountain itself felt watchful, the vast, snow-covered expanse separating them from civilization acting as both a barrier and a cage. As darkness fell, the first truly unnerving event occurred. A menacing, almost theatrical threat delivered via a distorted voice over the intercom, echoing the very menace that haunted their past. This wasn't just a reunion, it was a performance, and they were the unwilling actors. The following hours devolved into a desperate game of survival dictated by the mysterious tormentor. The friends, initially prone to bickering and blaming, were forced into immediate high-stakes cooperation. Mike, embracing the role of protector, often took reckless initiative, perhaps a residual effect of his desire to always win the game. Emily, fueled by adrenaline and her documentary instincts, pushed boundaries, documenting their terror even as she shared it. As the night deepened, the group began to separate, a fatal flaw in any horror scenario. Each splintered duo or solo venture introduced them to the mountain's dark secrets, which were far older and more visceral than the simple revenge they initially suspected. They encountered evidence of a hidden history, the remains of an old sanatorium perhaps, or remnants of a dark local legend involving wendigos, creatures of starvation and madness tied to the harsh wilderness. Josh's erratic behavior became a central mystery. Was he the mastermind, cracking under the pressure of guilt, or was he himself a victim of the same forces that plagued the others? His disjointed memories and deep-seated paranoia hinted at a truth buried deeper than the snow. The choices they faced were brutal and immediate. Sam, whose practical nature usually kept her steady, found herself making split-second decisions to save others, revealing an inner strength she hadn't known she possessed. Chris, trying to apply the lessons learned from the great tragic narratives he studied, struggled when real-life horror demanded brute action over poetic reflection. Matt, often underestimated, repeatedly placed himself in harm's way for Emily, a quiet testament to his steadfast loyalty, though his lack of strong assertion often put him at a disadvantage. The threat wasn't just external, it was woven into the very fabric of their relationships. Old resentments surfaced under duress, accusations flew, secrets spilled, and the thin veneer of college camaraderie dissolved into raw fear. The mountain seemed to feed on their conflict. In the pre-dawn hours, those who survived were battered, physically and emotionally scarred. The final confrontations were messy, chaotic scrambles against the encroaching entity, be it human, supernatural, or the manifestations of their own collective trauma. The survivors who finally staggered out into the cold morning light carried the weight of every life lost, realizing that the true horror wasn't just the violence enacted upon them, but the terrible things they had been forced to do to each other, or leave undone in the desperate, suffocating darkness of Blackwood Pines. The rising sun offered no cleansing, only the cold, hard evidence of a night that had irrevocably reshaped their futures. The lodge itself, a grand structure meant for celebratory gatherings, felt increasingly like a mausoleum, the heavy timber beams amplifying every creak and distant snap of wood from the surrounding forest. Sam, ever the pragmatist, kept checking the locks, her mind methodically running through escape routes, a skill perhaps honed from years of planning logistics for her future career, maybe in emergency management or something equally dependable, a direct reaction to the chaos she always feared. Mike, meanwhile, paced, his energy too high to be contained, his competitive streak making this deadly game feel like the ultimate, terrifying championship he was determined to win, perhaps fueled by the need to prove himself worthy of some past accolade he now felt was hollow. Josh, huddled near the cold fireplace, seemed less like a perpetrator and more like a vessel for the mountain's sorrow. His architectural blueprints, which he sometimes scribbled on compulsively, were now just chaotic lines mirroring the fragmentation of his mind, the guilt over his sisters a palpable, suffocating presence around him. Emily, surprisingly, found a dark focus. The camera felt like an extension of her eye, a necessary filter between the unbearable reality and her own sanity. Her ambition to capture the unfiltered human condition, a driving force in her quest for documentary filmmaking recognition, was now being met with the most extreme subject matter imaginable. Chris, the English major whose heroes were poets and thinkers, struggled profoundly with the primitive demands of survival, wishing desperately for a narrative structure where virtue was rewarded, not just brute chance. He saw the irony in being surrounded by the wild, romantic setting he usually idealized in literature, now revealed as something utterly monstrous. The early revelations about the mountain's lore, whispers of the Wendigo legend, the spirit of cannibalistic famine, added a layer of primal terror that transcended simple revenge plots. It suggested an ancient hunger, not just a localized score settling. Ashley, often the quietest, became unnervingly perceptive, her heightened awareness allowing her to sense shifts in the atmosphere moments before physical danger struck, perhaps a trait that would serve her well in a less lethal environment, maybe as a sensitivity analyst or a therapist. Matt, whose loyalty to Emily sometimes bordered on self-effacement, found a fierce core emerging when Emily was directly threatened, sacrificing his own safety with a surprising lack of hesitation, his quiet devotion finally given a necessary if deadly purpose. When the friends were forced to confront the first physical manifestation of their unseen enemy, the veneer of civilization shattered instantly. The ensuing struggle wasn't clean, it was messy, desperate grappling, the sound of tearing fabric and choked cries echoing in the vast emptiness. Each desperate act of self-preservation carved deeper rifts. There was a moment, perhaps, where Sam had to choose between two friends, a decision that felt less like a calculated risk and more like severing a piece of her own soul. Mike's confidence curdled into outright recklessness, making decisions that saved some lives while sealing the fate of others, actions driven by a frantic need to control the uncontrollable. The psychological toll was as devastating as any physical injury. The shared trauma forged a terrifying intimacy among the survivors, a bond born of witnessing the worst parts of each other. They weren't just fighting a threat outside, they were wrestling with the monstrous capabilities awakened within themselves. When the first weak light of dawn finally pierced the forest canopy, those who remained were shells, their faces etched with exhaustion and a profound, irreversible understanding of human fragility. The mountain had extracted its price, not just in bodies but in innocence, leaving behind a silence more deafening than any scream. The return of the weak sunlight did little to dispel the oppressive cold clinging to the air, a cold that seemed to seep not just from the snow, but from the very events of the night. The lodge, now smeared with the grim evidence of struggle, felt less like a refuge and more like the stage after the final curtain fell, strewn with the debris of shattered personalities. Sam, her hands shaking despite her attempts to steady them, found herself staring at a perfectly functional doorknob, the sheer mundanity of the object highlighting the absurdity of the horrors she had just navigated. Her future in management seemed a cruel joke now, as true leadership had been tested in the crucible of primal fear, revealing its true, terrifying nature. Mike, who had navigated the night with the fierce aggression of a cornered predator, now seemed lost, the adrenaline rush finally receding to reveal a vacant stare. His characteristic swagger was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out exhaustion. The victory he craved against the mountain had only resulted in profound, aching loss. He was left grappling not with winning, but with the unbearable cost of his own actions, the relentless drive that defined his athletic persona now seeming utterly meaningless. Josh's descent became the most heartbreaking spectacle. Whether the victim of a prank gone impossibly wrong or truly succumbing to the mountain's malice, he embodied the very tragedy they had come to commemorate. His whispers, fragments of apology mixed with nonsensical ramblings about protective walls and collapsing structures, painted a portrait of genius utterly undone by emotional collapse. If he had harbored intentions of orchestrating this terror, the reality had clearly consumed him whole, twisting his sorrow into something monstrous and self-destructive. Emily, having documented the unraveling of everything sacred, was wrestling with a profound ethical dilemma. The footage, if it existed and if she survived to edit it, would be career-defining, the ultimate exposé on human extremity, a perfect submission for any major documentary festival. Yet, looking at the faces of the few remaining, the camera felt like a lead weight, a betrayal of the fragile trust she had witnessed, or failed to maintain. Chris, conversely, found a dark sort of poetic understanding. The wilderness had stripped away all pretense, revealing humanity in its rawest, most unflattering form. He survived perhaps because he was less physically imposing, less of a threat, allowing the larger forces to overlook the observer who merely watched and catalogued the horror through a lens of existential dread. Ashley's quiet moments of insight, which had felt almost prescient during the night, now seemed like unbearable burdens. She knew things, felt things, that the others could not articulate, carrying the ghosts of the lost not just in memory, but as psychic residue. Matt's final, selfless act, a clear demonstration of love perhaps unrequited in the way he had hoped, left him profoundly altered. He had finally asserted himself not through words or ambition, but through absolute sacrifice, a resolution that was both deeply noble and tragically final for his character arc. As the last vestiges of night fled, the survivors moved with a shared, unspoken vow to never fully speak of the specifics, to bury the truth alongside the dead. The experience had been a brutal redefinition of identity. They left Blackwood Pines not as college friends taking a break, but as unwilling veterans of a private, silent war fought against ancient woods and their own darkest instincts, forever bound by the knowledge of what they had become when the lights went out. The journey back down the mountain, a necessary descent into the world they had tried to forget, was agonizingly slow. Each crunch of snow underfoot was an accusation, each breath of cold air a reminder of the scarcity of life. There was no triumphant escape, no rush to tell their story to the authorities. Instead, there was a profound, almost ritualistic need for silence. The silence was their shield against disbelief, against scrutiny, and most importantly, against the lingering memory of the sounds they had made, the desperate pleas and ragged breaths that haunted the pines. Sam took the lead on the drive, her focus absolute, channeling her organizational skills into the mechanics of escape, fuel gauge, road conditions, maintaining a steady, unalarming pace. She was the anchor, though the anchor itself felt dangerously close to snapping. Mike sat in the back, refusing eye contact, his former vibrancy replaced by a sullen stillness that suggested he was already serving a life sentence in his own head. His need to dominate, once channeled into sports championships, had manifested in lethal ways on the mountain, and now he seemed terrified of the sheer power he had discovered within himself. Emily clutched the camera bag, the weight of the potential evidence a physical burden on her lap. She debated, in the silent recesses of her mind, the ethics of exposure versus the therapeutic necessity of confession. To reveal the truth, to show the world the nightmare, felt like an act of vengeance against the mountain itself, yet exposing the vulnerability of the survivors felt like a final, unforgivable violation. Chris watched her occasionally, recognizing the familiar struggle of the artist forced to confront the limits of their medium, the terrible truth that some experiences cannot be framed, cut, or neatly concluded. Ashley remained withdrawn, her eyes fixed on the passing landscape, seeing not trees and snow, but the shadows that moved just beyond the periphery of clear vision. She seemed to communicate with the air itself, perhaps receiving residual warnings or echoes of the entity that had terrorized them. It was a strange form of survival. She had made it through by refusing to engage fully with the immediate physical reality, instead existing in a heightened state of sensory input. When they finally reached the first signs of civilization, a distant flickering gas station light, it felt less like salvation and more like an unwelcome intrusion of the ordinary world that demanded explanations they could never provide. The shared understanding among the remaining few was absolute. The narrative they would present to the outside world would be one of accident, isolation, and misfortune, a carefully curated lie designed to protect the fragments of the selves they hoped to rebuild. The mountain had taken their friends, yes, but it had also effectively rewritten the biographies of those who returned, leaving them forever branded as people who had looked too closely into the abyss and seen their own reflections staring back with predatory hunger. The mundane glow of the gas station sign felt abrasive, a harsh spotlight exposing the grime and internal wreckage they desperately tried to hide. Sam pulled the vehicle over with practiced efficiency, her hands gripping the wheel until her knuckles were white, treating the steering column like a lifeline. She was already constructing the framework of their joint testimony: a sudden storm, a misstep, tragic bad luck. Anything to explain the absence of the others without summoning the primal terror that clung to their clothing and haunted the edges of their vision. Her pragmatic mind, usually a comfort, was now a relentless engine of self-preservation and damage control. Mike exited the car first, moving with a stiff, unnatural gait, looking around the brightly lit, ordinary space as if expecting the familiar snow-covered trees to suddenly manifest behind the soda machines. The jock facade had crumbled entirely. He was now just a young man burdened by monstrous actions performed under duress. He avoided the attendant, focusing instead on wiping the interior of the windshield with a cloth he'd found, a futile attempt to scrub away the night's indelible stain. The competitive drive that once fueled his life now manifested as a paralyzing fear of accountability. Emily, standing slightly apart, finally lowered the camera bag to the ground, treating it with a strange mixture of reverence and disgust. She saw the footage not as a future career boost, but as a potential time capsule of human failure. Her ambition warred violently with her conscience. To release it would be to relive the horror daily, but to destroy it felt like erasing the only verifiable proof that their nightmare was real, that they hadn't collectively succumbed to mass hysteria. Chris offered her a tentative look of shared understanding, the silent recognition between two people who had witnessed the raw, unpoetic truth of human nature stripped bare. Ashley drifted towards the edge of the light, seeming to absorb the stillness of the night beyond the artificial illumination. She didn't speak of what she sensed, understanding that articulation would only draw unwanted attention to the thin veil separating the survivors from the darkness they'd escaped. She moved with an almost spectral grace, a living embodiment of trauma that processes through withdrawal rather than confrontation. She was already halfway back to the mountain in her mind, cataloging its secrets without needing a physical record. The act of purchasing gas felt like an elaborate charade, a performance of normalcy so strained it bordered on parody. They communicated only in clipped necessities, directions, payment, brief acknowledgments. The unwritten agreement was a covenant of silence, heavier than any spoken oath. They were tied together now, not by friendship, but by shared culpability and the desperate need to integrate into a world that would never truly accept their secret. The highway ahead stretched out, offering distance but no reprieve, promising a future where every loud noise, every unexpected shadow, would instantly transport them back to the unforgiving cold and desperate chaos of Blackwood Pines. The highway offered a false sense of linear progression, the miles clicking by underneath the tires but doing nothing to erase the spatial disorientation they felt. They were moving forward, yet every member of the surviving quartet felt irrevocably stranded in that terrifying pre-dawn moment on the mountain. The sun, now fully risen, beat down with an indifferent warmth that felt insulting. It was a day for picnics and clear skies, not for carrying the weight of the dead. Sam drove with a near-hypnotic focus, her eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. She rehearsed the details of their story, a camping trip gone awry, a sudden blizzard isolating them, the others perhaps venturing out for help and succumbing to exposure. It was a narrative rooted in plausible, natural disaster, the kind of tragedy news channels devoured and then quickly forgot. Yet, beneath the practiced composure, her hands twitched occasionally, remembering the desperate grip needed to secure a door against an unseen force. She saw her future in crisis management slipping further away. How could she manage external crises when her internal structure felt so utterly compromised? Mike, curled into a fetal position in the back seat, barely registered the change of scenery. His mind was stuck on replays, moments where a quicker reaction, a less aggressive move, might have altered the grim tally. The relentless drive that had defined his life, the need to dominate the field, had translated into a deadly impulse on the mountain, and now that impulse was a self-loathing anchor. He flinched violently when Chris accidentally shifted his weight, the slightest unexpected movement mimicking the sudden attacks they had endured. Emily, having finally placed the camera bag in the trunk, leaned her head against the window, the vibration doing little to soothe the throbbing behind her eyes. The footage, she knew it existed, was a curse and a potential legacy. If she was to become the documentarian she dreamed of being, this was the ultimate proof of concept, unflinching reality. But the cost of capturing that reality was the permanent shattering of the human connections she valued, even if those connections had proven fragile under pressure. She felt a wave of nausea, realizing that survival meant living alongside the memory of the choices she made while filming those last desperate moments. Chris sat beside her, outwardly the most composed, but internally reeling from the stark contrast between the celebrated heroism in literature and the ugly, messy necessity of their real-life survival. He understood now that tragedy wasn't elegant. It was about broken systems and failing defenses. He found himself silently cataloging the emotional vocabulary of the night. The guttural fear, the desperate bargaining, words he now knew intimately but would never dare write down. He felt a protective instinct towards Emily, not out of romance, but out of shared witness. They were the historians of this particular ruin. Ashley remained the mountain's silent ambassador. She kept her eyes averted from the others, as if their presence tainted the clarity she had achieved in the isolated darkness. She seemed to be listening to the road noise, interpreting it not as mechanical sound, but as warnings or perhaps the faint, receding echoes of the forest's call. Her survival felt less like an achievement and more like a temporary reprieve granted by the entity they had angered, a temporary parole granted to the quietest observer. As they approached the city limits, the transition from isolated wilderness to sprawling suburbia felt jarring, almost physically painful. The volume of traffic, the bright colors, the sheer number of unburdened people, it all felt like a violation of the solemn pact they had made on the snow. They were bringing the darkness back with them, a stowaway hidden beneath polite smiles and rehearsed alibis, knowing that the rest of their lives would be spent managing the fallout of a single, terrible weekend in the Blackwood Pines. The familiar grid of city streets, with their predictable traffic signals and relentless horns, initially offered a semblance of order, a structure they desperately craved after the chaos of the mountain. Yet this very predictability quickly became another form of torment. Every mundane interaction, buying coffee, answering a ringing phone, nodding politely to a neighbor, felt like a high-wire act performed without a net. They were living in camouflage, attempting to reintegrate their scarred selves into lives that seemed impossibly bright and ignorant. Sam immediately plunged herself into work, using the sheer volume of administrative tasks as a shield. She reorganized filing systems, optimized schedules, and took on extra shifts, her efficiency now a brittle armor against introspection. She avoided any scenario where she might be asked about her vacation, preemptively shutting down conversations about the mountain by talking endlessly about hypothetical disaster preparedness. It was a perfect coping mechanism for someone terrified of vulnerability, transforming raw fear into controllable processes. Mike found the gym, once his sanctuary of controlled aggression, suddenly unbearable. The cheers of spectators, the sound of weights clanging, it all echoed the desperate, uncontrolled violence of the night. He stopped training for competition, his physical prowess now seeming like a dangerous liability. He started taking long, solitary walks at odd hours, preferring the anonymous, unjudging darkness of the urban periphery to the false camaraderie of the sports team. He was attempting, clumsily, to re-engineer his identity from that of a winner to simply a survivor who caused minimal further damage. Emily faced the most direct confrontation with their shared past. She sequestered herself in her small apartment, the camera bag remaining unopened in its case, untouched for weeks. The thought of editing the footage felt akin to performing surgery on her own soul. She spent hours staring at the blank screen of her editing suite, realizing that the ambition that once drove her, the need to capture truth, was now poisoned. She understood that some truths weren't meant for public consumption. They were meant only for the few who had been forced to live them. Chris, ironically, found solace in the silence of the university library. Surrounded by volumes of classic literature, he sought out narratives where redemption was possible, where the descent into darkness was followed by a recognizable path back toward morality. He tried to connect with Emily, offering quiet support, recognizing that their shared experience made them uniquely qualified to understand the other's broken landscape. He wrote not about the Wendigo, but about the nature of shared guilt, his essays becoming increasingly dark, hinting at sacrifices made in the snow without ever revealing the specifics. Ashley remained almost entirely invisible. She moved through the city like a ghost, preferring public transport late at night or empty parks. She never answered calls from the others, not out of malice, but because their combined presence was too loud, too insistent on forming a cohesive narrative. She was listening for different frequencies now, perhaps hoping the mountain had released its grip entirely, or perhaps bracing for its inevitable reach back into the civilized world. The unspoken understanding held. They were bound by the missing bodies and the silent agreement never to speak the true names of their tormentors or the true nature of their own desperate acts. This secrecy wasn't just to protect themselves from the law, it was to protect the outside world from the contagious horror they carried within. They were functional members of society by day, performing the required rituals, but at night, each survivor retreated to a self-imposed solitude, forever estranged from the easy camaraderie they once shared, haunted by the ghosts that only they could truly see. The city's relentless energy, the constant hum of traffic and the incessant flow of faces served only to amplify the profound isolation that settled over the four survivors. They moved through their routines like automatons programmed with elaborate alibis, the artificiality of their new lives becoming increasingly exhausting to maintain. The shared trauma had acted as a corrosive agent, dissolving the superficial bonds of college friendship and leaving behind something harder, more defensive, and utterly solitary. Sam found herself obsessively tracking weather patterns across the entire continent, a strange, involuntary extension of her need for control. A distant storm warning on the news could send her into a silent panic, convinced that the mountain's influence was somehow expanding, reaching out through atmospheric pressure. She avoided looking at professional journals related to her field, the glossy covers depicting successful team-building exercises, seeming like cruel mockeries of the brutal, forced cohesion they had experienced. Her practicality was now a rigid defense mechanism, a dam holding back a flood of guilt over decisions made when survival instincts overrode morality. Mike had taken a menial, solitary job involving overnight inventory, the repetitive labor offering a dull thud against the sharpness of his memories. He carried himself with a strange, unnatural stillness, every movement measured, as if afraid that any sudden burst of speed might trigger the dormant savagery that had surfaced in the woods. He often looked at his hands, hands that had fought and pushed and perhaps struck, and saw not the hands of a promising athlete, but those of an animal. He harbored a deep, unspoken envy for Josh, whose complete breakdown felt, paradoxically, like a form of escape from the ongoing responsibility of living with the truth. Emily's apartment became a fortress of denial. The camera case remained sealed, but she kept the memory card tucked inside a small silver locket she wore constantly, proof, not for the world, but for herself, that she hadn't merely dreamed it. Her ambition had been redirected. She now fixated on ethical consumption and minimalist living, reacting against the overabundance of evidence she possessed. She struggled to form new relationships, terrified that any genuine closeness would inevitably lead to the moment she would have to choose between revealing the secret and betraying the person standing before her. Chris, the erstwhile scholar of human struggle, found the greatest irony in his survival. He had always studied the grand tragedies, the fall of heroes, the inescapable fate, but the reality of Blackwood Pines was dirtier, fueled by bad luck and base instinct rather than epic destiny. He tried to articulate the experience not through academic prose but through fragmented, abstract poetry, verses he immediately burned after writing. He understood that his survival was likely owed to being unremarkable in the moment of ultimate crisis, a footnote rather than a protagonist. He felt a constant low-grade responsibility to protect Emily's secret, understanding that the film, if ever viewed, would destroy them all far more effectively than any winter storm. Ashley remained the most detached, a living barometer of lingering dread. She started frequenting art galleries, drawn to abstract pieces that conveyed pure emotion without narrative structure. She was attempting to translate the inarticulable terror into something visual, something that could be observed without demanding explanation. Sometimes, in the quietest moments of the city night, she would feel a faint, cold breeze enter her sealed apartment, a sensation that signaled the lingering presence of the mountain, a patient, ancient force that knew time was on its side, waiting for one of them to finally crack and speak the unspeakable. The city, for all its supposed complexity, offered no real refuge. It merely provided a vast, anonymous backdrop against which their private horrors could play out unseen. The survivors learned to navigate the social currents with practiced ease, mastering the art of the shallow acknowledgement. They existed on parallel tracks, occasionally intersecting at moments of forced necessity, each encounter leaving them feeling more exposed than the last. Sam, driven by a profound anxiety that masked itself as hyper-organization, started volunteering for disaster relief outside the city limits. It was a desperate attempt to engage with controllable catastrophes, a controlled burn after surviving an uncontrolled inferno. She found a strange solace in the predictability of flood zones and logistical nightmares, environments where the rules of survival were clear and externally imposed. Yet, in the dead of night, the image of a locked door she couldn't hold against the pressure would flicker behind her eyes, undermining her belief in any lasting security. Mike began volunteering at an animal shelter drawn to creatures that communicated through raw, uncomplicated need rather than complex, deceitful human language. His physical strength, once a source of pride, was now something he carefully suppressed, using it only for heavy lifting, never for assertion. He adopted the largest, most intimidating dogs, projecting his own internalized fear and need for control onto them, seeking to tame the wildness he feared he still harbored. His quiet devotion to these animals was his penance, a meager offering against the weight of his forgotten humanity. Emily's turning point came subtly. One afternoon, while aimlessly scrolling through news archives, she stumbled upon an old article referencing the Blackwood Pines area, a local legend about a mining disaster and strange disappearances decades prior. It wasn't the Wendigo that had hunted them, perhaps, but the environment itself, a place saturated with past suffering that had reached a critical mass. This realization freed her slightly from the singular focus on revenge or supernatural forces. It suggested a systemic failure, a geological or historical resonance that might be easier to categorize than pure malice. She finally took the memory card out of the locket, not to edit, but to put it into a safe deposit box, acknowledging the story existed without succumbing to its immediate telling. Chris started tutoring, finding a strange comfort in guiding younger students through logical thought processes. He attempted to build mental scaffolding for Emily, helping her parse the narrative of their survival into manageable, less emotionally charged segments. His quiet intellectualism, once seen as passive, now served as a necessary buffer against the emotional volatility of the others. He didn't offer false comfort. Instead, he offered clarity, the belief that understanding how they survived was the only way to begin rebuilding what they were. Ashley remained the silent seismograph of their shared secret. She rarely saw the others, but when she did, usually by accident in a grocery store or a quiet park bench, the acknowledgement was a brief, shared look of profound exhaustion. She had begun painting small, intense canvases, all shades of white, gray, and impenetrable black, capturing the visual emptiness of the mountain's snowdrifts and the absolute void of the night. These paintings, hidden in her cramped apartment, were her true testimony, a nonverbal scream that only she understood, yet they were undeniably real, a stark contrast to the constructed reality the others maintained. The city continued its oblivious spin, but for the four who returned, the mountain was not miles behind them. It was a permanent, cold core in their center, a shared truth that ensured they would always remain slightly out of sync with the rest of the world, forever listening for the sound of snapping branches in the quiet corners of their lives. The forced integration into normal life began to wear thin, revealing the deep fissures in their carefully constructed facades. The rhythm of the city, once a potential anesthetic, now felt like a cruel metronome counting down to an unknown relapse. It was a world too loud, too brightly lit, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness they had become intimately familiar with. Sam's attempts at managing external crises became increasingly erratic. During a large-scale, non-life-threatening infrastructure failure downtown, she reportedly attempted to reroute emergency services based on protocols she'd developed entirely in her head, protocols that involved military-style rationing and immediate evacuation zones. Her superiors, baffled by the intensity of her reaction, suggested mandatory leave. This forced downtime only intensified her focus on the past. She started obsessively researching the specific history of the Blackwood Pines region, moving past folklore into geological surveys and old property disputes, seeking a concrete, solvable reason for the horror, something that didn't involve inexplicable monsters or deep personal failure. Mike's relationship with the shelter dogs became strained. He discovered that while he could provide physical care, he couldn't project genuine affection onto them without feeling like he was attempting to manipulate their loyalty, mirroring his past behavior with his friends. One evening, after a particularly large German Shepherd refused to eat, Mike had a full-blown panic attack, convinced the dog was sensing the darkness within him. He retreated further, spending days at a time in his sparsely furnished apartment, surviving on instant meals, his physical prowess now a source of shame rather than pride. He often thought of Josh, recognizing that Josh's descent, while tragic, had at least been absolute, no lingering performance required. Emily finally opened the camera case, not to view the footage, but to handle the hardware. The cold metal of the camera felt like a relic from another life. Her documentary ambition had curdled into a near-pathological fear of recording anything substantial. She started using a disposable point-and-shoot camera only for banal snapshots of her morning coffee or the view from her window, images so meaningless they served as an active statement against documenting anything of consequence. She reached out tentatively to Chris, not to discuss the horrors, but to discuss narrative theory, attempting to frame the experience within the safety of academia, a desperate attempt to process visceral trauma through intellectual distance. Chris found that his proximity to Emily was both a comfort and a danger. He saw the ghost of the documentarian dying in her eyes and felt compelled to keep the shared secret intact, viewing their silence as the final act of loyalty to the departed. However, his academic pursuits suffered. The detachment required for literary analysis felt impossible when his reality was saturated with unresolved, visceral horror. He started seeing patterns in seemingly random events, a misplaced book, a delayed bus, as veiled messages from the mountain, evidence that their ordeal was not over, merely postponed. Ashley, in her self-imposed isolation, began leaving anonymous, cryptic notes in public places, a line of poetry hinting at starvation, a sketch of a distorted, elongated shadow. She felt a growing conviction that the only way to truly sever the connection was to externalize the horror in a way that wouldn't implicate them directly, hoping that these small, artistic offerings might appease whatever ancient consciousness still watched. She was trying to pay a debt without confessing to the crime, operating on an instinctual, almost spiritual level that the others, steeped in their practical and intellectual defenses, couldn't possibly grasp. They were all survivors, but only Ashley seemed willing to acknowledge that they were also, perhaps, still prisoners. The unspoken agreement that bound them began to fray under the unrelenting pressure of ordinary life. The construction of their lives was proving more taxing than the ordeal itself. The very air in the city, thick with the exhaust and false promises of success, seemed to reject their presence, amplifying the sense that they were interlopers wearing ill-fitting skins. Sam's attempt to control external chaos reached a breaking point during a mandatory counseling session. When the therapist gently probed about the nature of the isolation she felt, Sam's composure finally fractured. She didn't confess the Wendigo or the violence. Instead, she described the mountain as a flawless, self-contained ecosystem where decisions had immediate, verifiable consequences. She articulated a perverse longing for that brutal clarity, contrasting it sharply with the murky ambiguity of urban life, where consequences seemed to evaporate into bureaucracy. Her counselor interpreted this as classic PTSD stemming from survivor's guilt, a diagnosis Sam accepted only because it was neat and confined, neatly sidestepping the actual truth. Mike, unable to reconcile his physical presence with his internal cowardice, began actively seeking out minor physical altercations in dimly lit bars. These brief, controlled bursts of aggression were attempts to burn off the residual adrenaline, to prove, if only to himself, that he could still handle conflict without crossing that terrible moral line again. Each petty fight ended quickly, leaving him feeling hollowed out but momentarily free of the heavy inertia of memory. He became nocturnal, drawn to the anonymity of the city's underbelly, seeking environments where his silence wouldn't be scrutinized by the innocent. Emily finally took the memory card out of the vault. Holding it, she felt a dizzying mix of revulsion and creative hunger. Her documentary aspirations hadn't died. They had been refined into something much darker. She didn't call Chris. Instead, she started assembling the footage, not chronologically, but thematically, focusing solely on the moments of choice, the split-second decisions that defined character under extreme duress. She began to narrate the footage in her head, stripping the dialogue bare, turning the screams into raw auditory data. She realized that if she ever released it, the film wouldn't be about the monster. It would be about the terrifying cold calculus of human self-preservation. This private editing became her new obsession, replacing connection with production. Chris watched the slow disintegration of his friends with the sorrowful detachment of a scholar studying a fallen empire. He saw Sam retreating into rigid control, Mike into self-punishment, and Emily into the detached analysis of their own destruction. His own survival felt predicated on his ability to observe without participating actively in the emotional fallout. He began carrying a small leather-bound notebook, not for poetry, but for cataloging the subtle linguistic shifts in their interactions, the way they used past tense for shared friends, the subtle difference in their voices when they spoke of that trip versus the night. He was compiling the dictionary of their shared unspoken language, the only true record of their experience. Ashley's enigmatic communications grew bolder. One evening, a local newspaper ran a small feature on an odd series of abstract graffiti appearing around abandoned industrial areas, paintings mirroring the stark, cold void she captured on her canvases. The article framed it as an intriguing, if unsettling, new urban art movement. Ashley read the piece with a grim sense of satisfaction. She was externalizing the mountain's residue, making the invisible visible on her own terms. She knew this wouldn't last. Eventually, the real world would demand a coherent explanation, and the small abstract offerings would either be dismissed or, worse, connected to the unsolved disappearances that lingered like an unanswered question hanging over the entire region. The city was merely a pause button, and the mountain, she felt certain, was still waiting for them to tire of the performance. The anticipated 2025 adaptation of the seminal interactive horror experience, Until Dawn, faces the formidable task of translating a deeply branching narrative driven by player choice into a linear cinematic form. The foundation of its success or failure rests not merely on replicating jump scares, though the Wendigo lore and the mountain setting demand atmospheric dread, but on skillfully managing the weight of consequence, the core mechanic that defined the source material. Directorially, the choice of a visionary known for character-driven psychological thrillers rather than pure slasher fare seems intentional. If the filmmakers lean into the underlying themes of trauma, inherited guilt, and the pressure cooker dynamics of young adulthood, the film transcends simple creature feature status. The narrative, set against the backdrop of Blackwood Pines, inherently explores the fragility of interpersonal relationships under extreme duress. We must see the genuine evolution or degradation of the bonds between the core 8 characters. Consider the character arcs. If the film casts actors who can embody the underlying tensions hinted at in the game, for instance, the strained relationship between Sam and Mike, or the complicated history between Jess and Mike, the stakes feel instantly higher. The film needs moments where decisions, even small ones that might translate to minor plot divergences in the game, feel agonizingly weighty on screen. This requires actors capable of conveying immense internal conflict without relying on explicit exposition. The subtle glance, the hesitation before action, these become the cinematic equivalents of the "don't move" prompts. The cinematic interpretation of the butterfly effect is crucial. In the game, small actions accumulate to determine survival. The film cannot simply present 8 different endings. It must weave the threads of cause and effect so subtly that the audience feels the inevitability of certain fates, even if those fates were technically avoidable based on earlier, seemingly insignificant choices. If we see a character exhibiting a heroic trait early on, that heroism must be paid for later, perhaps by putting someone else at risk, mirroring the game's dedication to moral ambiguity over simple heroism. Furthermore, the integration of the supplementary lore, Dr. Hill's psychiatric sessions, and the historical context of the psycho and the disappearance of the miners must be handled with delicacy. These elements provide intellectual scaffolding for the horror, deepening the existential dread beyond mere monster attacks. If the adaptation treats these segments as simple exposition dumps, the intellectual appeal of Until Dawn evaporates, leaving only a standard horror movie. A successful adaptation will use Dr. Hill's analysis not as mere setup, but as commentary on the characters' flaws as they are actively failing one another on the mountain. The visual language must balance the stark, isolated beauty of the snowy mountain setting with the visceral terror of the hostile environment and the Wendigo threat. The original game excelled at using camera angles and lighting to isolate characters, even when they were grouped together. The film needs a cinematographer willing to embrace deep shadows and claustrophobic framing within the lodge, contrasting sharply with the vast, exposed danger of the exterior wilderness. The practical effects used for the Wendigo, if prioritized over glossy CGI, will retain the grounded, terrifying physicality that made the creature so memorable. Ultimately, the film's resonance will depend on whether it honors the game's commitment to consequence, transforming player agency into palpable dramatic tension. The casting process alone signals the depth the filmmakers are aiming for. We might anticipate established young dramatic actors, perhaps those whose previous work hinted at a capability for sustained emotional turmoil rather than purely comedic or blockbuster fare. Imagine an actress known for intricate portrayals of suppressed anxiety taking on the role of Emily, whose sharp tongue often masks deep insecurity, making her inevitable moments of panic feel earned rather than forced. Or an actor whose established screen persona thrives on simmering resentment being cast as Matt, whose inherent decency is tested to breaking point by circumstances largely beyond his control. The emotional landscape of the film hinges on the audience's investment in these manufactured relationships. The inherent drama of the setup, a reunion meant to heal old wounds, ironically serving as the catalyst for ultimate destruction, requires screenwriters skilled at layering subtext. We need scenes that echo the tension of a fraught therapy session, where every shared glance across the dinner table carries the weight of past betrayals. When the initial threat emerges, the breakdown of these fragile alliances must feel organic. If Josh, burdened by his own internal turmoil hinted at in the game's supplementary material, snaps under pressure, that descent must be charted meticulously, showing the cracks forming long before the first scream echoes through the pines. His portrayal demands an actor capable of shifting seamlessly from awkward, relatable awkwardness to terrifying, unstable menace. The threat itself, the Wendigo, must serve less as a monster to be fought and more as an environmental manifestation of the character's collective moral failure. In the interactive medium, the creature hunted those who made poor choices regarding concealment or speed. In the film, this translates to thematic targeting. If a character is defined by their arrogance early on, say Mike's tendency towards reckless bravado, the narrative must steer that specific character towards confrontations where recklessness is fatal. The fear shouldn't just come from the appearance of the beast, but from the chilling recognition that this creature embodies the consequences of their own hubris, a physical representation of their collective inability to mature and take responsibility for their shared past tragedy. Furthermore, the pacing must be expertly calibrated to reflect the game's dual nature. Slow, creeping psychological dread interwoven with sudden, paralyzing bursts of action. The early sequences in the lodge should prioritize establishing the suffocating atmosphere of enforced intimacy and simmering resentment, using long takes and ambient sound design, the creak of old wood, the distant howl of the wind, to build tension. Only after the audience is deeply settled into the character's neuroses should the mechanical precision of the horror begin its sustained assault. This transition must feel like a physical shift in the film's energy, mirroring the transition from awkward party to desperate survival scenario. The success of this adaptation will be measured by whether it makes the viewer feel the impossibility of escape, not just through jump scares, but through the inescapable logic of the narrative consequences unfolding before them. The inherent melodrama of a group of privileged youths confronting mortality necessitates casting choices that avoid caricature. If the film leans too heavily into genre tropes for characters like Ashley, whose initial cautiousness can easily devolve into a screaming victim stereotype, the nuanced investigation into her own fearful decision-making process is lost. The performance must excavate the fear driving her actions. Is it genuine terror, or is it the paralysis of overthinking, a distinctly modern form of defense mechanism? The filmmakers must respect the source material's attempt to give each character a recognizable psychological foundation, however flawed, upon which their survival choices are built. The visual language surrounding the isolation must extend beyond the physical geography of the mountain. Consider the claustrophobia within the lodge itself. The design must emphasize the architectural legacy of the house, the way it traps them with its heavy doors and shadowed hallways, making it a character unto itself. This structure acts as a psychological cage mirroring the emotional cages the characters have built around themselves regarding the events of the previous year. The use of reflective surfaces, windows at night, polished wooden floors, could become a subtle visual motif, forcing characters, and the audience, to constantly confront their own strained reflections amidst the chaos. Moreover, the dynamic involving the more antagonistic relationships requires careful orchestration. The tension between Mike and Jess, for instance, when viewed through a retrospective lens, is ripe for dramatic exploration. If the adaptation allows moments where their underlying, perhaps even genuine affection surfaces just moments before extreme danger strikes them, the sudden loss or separation becomes far more impactful than a simple casualty count. These glimpses of buried humanity underscore the tragedy. These are not interchangeable victims, but people whose lives, however messy, were tangled together. The handling of the supernatural elements must maintain a careful equilibrium. The terror evoked by the miner's fate and the Wendigo lore must remain tethered to the psychological state of the survivors. If the Wendigo is too visible too early, it risks becoming mere spectacle. Instead, its presence should often be suggested through corrupted environment, a snapped branch that seems too forceful, a fleeting shadow glimpsed in peripheral vision that the character doubts they actually saw. This technique forces the audience into the same unreliable perspective as the characters, constantly questioning whether the danger is external, the psycho, the monster, or internal, shared hysteria, guilt manifesting as paranoia. The film should ultimately argue that their inability to trust each other, rooted in their shared past, is the most effective weapon wielded against them, far more dangerous than any physical predator. The success of adapting the game's intricate moral calculus into a compelling cinematic experience hinges on how convincingly the film portrays the burden of responsibility. In the interactive format, the player feels the sting of every wrong choice. The film must transfer that weight onto the actors so that the audience experiences secondhand guilt. This is particularly critical for characters positioned as protectors or decision-makers early on, such as Sam. If Sam is written with genuine reluctance toward confrontation, a desire to keep the peace, Her moments of necessary, violent agency later on must feel earned through profound emotional expenditure, not simply dictated by genre necessity. We need to see the cost of that choice etched on her face. The moment where the innocence of simply wanting to survive clashes with the grim reality of having to actively harm another being, even a monstrous one. The narrative structure also demands a sophisticated use of foreshadowing that avoids predictability. Given that many viewers of the film may have played the game, the filmmakers must find ways to subvert expectations regarding standard horror beats. If an audience member anticipates a particular character will die based on their earlier recklessness, the film should either deliver that fate with an unexpected twist in the mechanics of their demise, or, more interestingly, allow that character to narrowly survive through an act of selfless sacrifice that fundamentally alters their perceived trajectory. This kind of narrative misdirection honors the spirit of consequence without simply adhering to a script of known outcomes. It suggests that even in a predetermined framework, the manner of surviving or failing remains profoundly human. Furthermore, the exploration of the psycho element, the lingering threat of the human antagonist, must be integrated seamlessly with the supernatural horror. The film should treat the psycho not as a red herring or a separate threat, but as the initial manifestation of the mountain's corrupting influence. This human element grounds the terror, making the early sequences relatable before escalating to the mythological. A director drawing inspiration from films that masterfully weave paranoia with overt horror, perhaps those emphasizing oppressive atmosphere over explicit gore, will understand that the most terrifying moment is often the quiet realization that the threat is both among them and beyond their understanding. The gradual unveiling of the truth about the prank and the subsequent disappearance of the two friends from the year prior must be sprinkled throughout the film with increasing clarity, ensuring that the final revelations feel like a synthesis of all preceding psychological pressures rather than a sudden, tacked-on explanation. The mountain must be presented as a crucible that burns away pretense, revealing the true character, or fatal flaw, of each young adult. The film's commitment to realism in portraying panic and breakdown under stress will ultimately define its effectiveness as a modern horror piece. We should look for performances that eschew the typical wide-eyed screaming common in lesser thrillers, instead favoring the kind of contained, almost desperate physical reactions seen in actors who excel at portraying acute trauma response. Consider the character of Chris, often portrayed as the quiet, reliable one. If the actor chosen possesses the ability to convey deep internal processing, his moments of decision, to flee or to confront, should be visibly agonizing, illustrating the cognitive overload that genuine fear induces. His survival, or lack thereof, should hinge on whether he manages to break through his ingrained reticence, a narrative mirror to anyone struggling with social anxiety suddenly forced into a leadership position. The environment must also reflect this psychological strain. The Blackwood Pines Lodge, meant to be a sanctuary, needs to feel increasingly hostile as the narrative progresses. This isn't just about broken windows, it's about how the shadows behave. Perhaps the cinematographer uses practical lighting sources, flickering lamps, the weak beams of flashlights, to create moving, untrustworthy fields of vision. This visual uncertainty reinforces the characters' inability to trust their senses, making every creak in the floorboards a potential harbinger of doom. When the Wendigo finally appears, its presence should feel like an intrusion of raw, untamed chaos into their fragile, structured environment, a visual representation of the guilt they tried to wall off from their conscious minds. Moreover, the bond between Beth and Hannah, though tragically fractured before the film's opening, needs a lingering emotional resonance that informs the actions of the remaining group, especially Josh. If the film grants the audience subtle visual flashbacks, perhaps distorted memories triggered by finding an old photograph or visiting a specific location on the mountain, these brief emotional plunges can humanize the horror. They remind us that the stakes are not just physical survival, but the preservation of memory and the redemption, however small, of a lost past. If Josh's descent into madness is rooted in an inability to process that specific familial trauma, his character arc becomes the tragic centerpiece of the entire event, positioning the entire scenario less as a random monster attack and more as a prolonged, catastrophic reckoning with unaddressed grief. The film must make us feel that this mountain does not just kill, it exploits existing fractures. The challenge for the screenwriters, when adapting the game's layered structure, lies in maintaining the high stakes associated with the perceived fragility of the group dynamic, without resorting to excessive, repetitive danger sequences. The early moments, established after the initial separation and first signs of trouble, must focus on suspicion hardening into genuine fear. If the film casts actors who excel at conveying simmering resentment, like Emily's frequent barbed comments toward others, these moments should build an emotional reservoir that pays off when real danger forces an unlikely alliance. The audience must believe that these individuals want to turn on each other before they are forced to rely on each other. This manufactured antagonism, born from a year of unspoken tension, is what makes their eventual cooperation, when necessary for survival, feel earned and narratively satisfying. Furthermore, the character of the estranged friend, the one whose absence instigated the reunion, must serve as a potent emotional anchor, even if they are only present in memory or through the consequences of their fate. The film needs to visually articulate the ghost of this missing person, showing how their memory influences the remaining friendships, driving some to overcompensate with forced cheerfulness and others toward quiet guilt. This is where the film's atmosphere needs to be relentlessly oppressive. The deep snow and the isolation of Blackwood Pines should feel less like a picturesque setting and more like an active adversary, swallowing sound and amplifying the feeling that any communication with the outside world is futile. The practicalities of the remote location, dead cell service, dwindling supplies, must become constant, tangible reminders of their entrapment, driving frantic, poorly thought-out decisions. The pacing of the Wendigo encounters must evolve significantly from the game's pattern of sudden threats. The film should move from the ambiguity of the human threat, the lurking possibility of another prank gone too far, to the undeniable, relentless physicality of the supernatural entity. When the true monster is revealed, the focus should pivot from the characters hiding from something to the characters actively fighting their own impulses toward self-preservation at the expense of others. If Mike, perhaps relying on his established physical confidence, takes an early, ill-advised heroic risk, the resulting consequence must be disproportionately severe, shattering the illusion that physical strength is the key to survival. The film needs to communicate, through visceral effect and lingering shots of the aftermath, that every successful evasion only postpones a confrontation with their own inadequacies, not with the creature itself. The Wendigo is the consequence made flesh, and its attacks should feel intimately tied to the moral failures of the group from the prior year. The success of translating the game's emphasis on immediate life-or-death reactions into a compelling cinematic framework necessitates an almost surgical approach to visual rhythm. We cannot rely on the novelty of quick-time events. Instead, the filmmaking must embody that tense hesitance. Consider the moments where a character must choose between silence and flight. If the camera lingers on the actor's face, perhaps an actor known for their ability to convey profound internal debate through minimal facial expression, we need to see the milliseconds of calculation, the weighing of potential outcomes playing out in their eyes. This requires masterful sound design too. The absence of sound during these crucial seconds can amplify the internal monologue far more effectively than any narrated thought. The emotional core tied to Josh's narrative requires a delicate touch, given the complexity of portraying mental instability under extreme duress. If the actor leans too far into theatrical mania too early, the mystery unravels. The performance must map the slow erosion of his sanity, suggesting that his actions are not purely villainous, but deeply symptomatic of unresolved trauma. His relationship with his friends, particularly the lingering pity or resentment they carry for him, must color every interaction. When the group finally realizes the true nature of the threat involving him, the horror should be compounded by the tragic realization that they failed to see the very real, very human danger brewing beneath his carefully constructed facade. This failure of empathy becomes another nail in the coffin of their collective survival chances. Furthermore, the film must treat the Wendigo not just as a physical obstacle, but as a symbolic force reflecting the narrative's themes of isolation and broken promises. The creature's hunting patterns, in the adaptation, should subtly correlate with the locations or objects significant to the prior year's tragedy. If a crucial mistake was made near the fire pit, perhaps the next attack strategically draws a survivor back to that scorched earth. This interwoven environment elevates the horror from random chance to inescapable poetic justice. The mountain itself, draped in unforgiving white, becomes a vast, indifferent stage where the characters' secrets are violently exposed. The sheer scale of the wilderness surrounding the small, vulnerable lodge must constantly suggest that even if they survive the night, the psychological isolation of carrying their guilt will never truly end. The audience should leave feeling not just relieved that some survived, but deeply uneasy about the emotional scars that remain, implying that the true monster resides within the human capacity for secrecy and self-deception. The adaptation must carefully calibrate the audience's evolving perception of the antagonists. Initially, the introduction of a potential human stalker, the shadow in the woods, the misplaced object, serves to establish immediate, relatable paranoia. This allows the film to exploit the character's pre-existing mistrust, especially around Josh's erratic behavior, making the audience complicit in suspecting the wrong source of danger. This early phase demands a focus on atmospheric tension, utilizing long, slow camera movements that keep the frame visually ambiguous, suggesting threats just beyond the edge of perception. Actors capable of conveying palpable anxiety through stillness rather than constant movement will be essential here, making the very act of waiting feel exhausting and dangerous. As the narrative progresses and the supernatural threat of the Wendigo becomes undeniable, the focus must shift from who is hunting them to why they are being hunted. This demands a visual language that emphasizes the creature's connection to the past. If the Wendigo is interpreted through the lens of cannibalism and the miner's desperate fate, its attacks should carry an unnerving intelligence, a perverse recognition of the mountain's history, repeating itself through the foolishness of the new inhabitants. A director known for detailed creature design, perhaps one who prioritizes unsettling, gangly physicality over brute force, will ensure the Wendigo remains a source of existential dread rather than just a powerful beast. Its sounds, the clicking, the imitation of human calls, should be used sparingly but effectively, exploiting the vulnerability of auditory confusion in the dead of winter. Crucially, the film needs to honor the individual survivor paths in a way that feels inevitable yet tragic, rather than arbitrary. For instance, if one character, say Emily, displays remarkable resilience and strategic thinking under pressure, her survival should not be guaranteed. Instead, that very resilience should lead her to a scenario where her best strategic move inadvertently puts another, perhaps more morally deserving character in mortal peril. This complex moral calculus prevents easy audience alignment with any single survivor. We should be left questioning not just if they survived, but at what cost to their own humanity. The ending, regardless of who remains, must feel heavy, a testament to luck interwoven with terrible choices, not a triumphant victory over evil. The final shots should linger on the survivors' damaged psyches, suggesting that escaping Blackwood Pines does not equate to escaping the trauma it inflicted. The cinematic translation of the inherent moral weight of Until Dawn requires the screenplay to treat the lodge not merely as a set piece, but as a psychological testing ground where architectural elements mirror emotional states. The hallways, perpetually shadowed despite the sparse light sources, should feel like arteries clogged with past unspoken resentments. For characters like Jess, whose initial appearance is defined by a somewhat shallow flirtatiousness, the film must quickly pivot to reveal the genuine fear beneath that veneer. When peril strikes, her performance needs to convey the agonizing realization that her attempts to project confidence have left her fundamentally unprepared for true vulnerability, making her inevitable confrontations with the horror deeply personal and shocking. The integration of the lore surrounding the psycho must maintain a razor-thin balance between plausibility and outright madness. If the early mystery surrounding the masked figure is too easily solved, the film sacrifices the sustained paranoia that forces the characters to turn on one another. We need extended sequences where the group actively debates whether the threat is external, the supposed psycho exacting revenge, or internal, one of them cracking under the pressure of the reunion. This ambiguity forces the audience to adopt the same suspicious viewpoint, making the eventual reveal of the Wendigo lore both a horrifying escalation and a moment of tragic clarity. The human madness was merely a precursor to the elemental horror. The fate of the relationship dynamics, particularly those defined by codependency or conflict, offers the richest ground for dramatic payoff. If Mike and Sam share a history that involves Mike's controlling tendencies, his subsequent moments of genuine selflessness must be rendered with a palpable sense of struggle, as if he is actively fighting his established persona to protect her. If this transformation is not convincingly portrayed by the actor, perhaps one with a background emphasizing intense, brooding romantic leads, the heroic gestures will feel unearned. Conversely, if the film allows a character like Matt, often positioned as the loyal but somewhat peripheral figure, to make a truly selfless, defining sacrifice, this quiet heroism should shock the audience precisely because it contrasts so sharply with the flamboyant displays of bravery from the more outwardly dominant characters. Such moments underscore the film's core message. True character is revealed not in safety, but in the final, desperate calculus of altruism versus survival. The landscape of Blackwood Pines is unforgiving because it demands authenticity, stripping away facade until only the raw instinct for preservation or sacrifice remains. The very structure of the film adaptation needs to reflect the game's obsession with inescapable memory. The environment should actively participate in the haunting. For instance, every time the characters retreat to a seemingly safe corner of the lodge, that space should carry an echo of the preceding year's tragedy. Perhaps a specific piece of furniture or a faded photograph triggers a momentary, almost subliminal visual flare, a brief glimpse of the night the friends disappeared, only visible to the audience for a fraction of a second. This relentless visual tethering ensures that the horror is rooted not just in the present threat, but in the foundational guilt the characters brought with them. An actor playing Josh, for example, whose performance must navigate the narrow channel between victim and perpetrator, could benefit from portraying his initial instability as a series of involuntary responses to these environmental cues, suggesting that the mountain is actively showing him what he cannot process internally. Moreover, the film must tackle the difficulty of portraying group decision-making without becoming static or dialogue-heavy. The equivalent of the game's "don't move" prompts in a cinematic context relies heavily on an actor's ability to freeze, to hold a single, fraught expression while danger passes inches away. This demands performances characterized by intense physical restraint. We need to feel the strain in the actors' muscles as they attempt absolute stillness, conveying the internal scream held captive by the necessity of silence. If a character breaks this silence prematurely, the resulting catastrophe must be swift and devastating, reinforcing the idea that improvisation against an unseen ancient enemy is almost always fatal. The Wendigo itself needs to evolve visually as the film progresses, mirroring the descent into madness of the survivors. Early encounters should utilize shadow, quick cuts, and misdirection, maintaining the ambiguity of the human threat. However, as the characters are driven to more desperate acts, perhaps resorting to violence against one another in moments of confusion, the creature's appearance should become more defined, almost as if the group's own savagery grants it greater physical manifestation. This symbolic alignment suggests the Wendigo is not simply an external monster, but a reflection of the darkness awakened within the group by their own past transgressions. A finale where the creature seems almost triumphant in its horrifying physicality would underscore the theme that their shared secrets gave the horror permission to exist in the first place. The final note should be one of exhausted survival, where the survivors are left not with closure, but with the chilling knowledge that they were fundamentally changed, or perhaps revealed, by the ordeal. The success of the cinematic venture ultimately hinges on whether the screenplay manages to distribute the emotional load equitably among the 8 main characters, ensuring that no single actor is left solely responsible for carrying the film's terror. For a character like Emily, whose narrative trajectory often involves intense confrontation and abrasive competence, her moments of vulnerability must be earned through visible physical and psychological exhaustion. We need to see the toll that constantly assessing threats takes on her, suggesting that her sharp intellect is also a heavy burden. If she relies on a background in high-pressure decision-making, perhaps derived from a career in competitive debate or crisis management, elements hinted at in the game's supplementary profiles, her calculated risks should feel authentic, even when they spectacularly backfire, thus demonstrating that competence is no shield against supernatural malice. The interpersonal conflicts need to feel amplified by the extreme environment. The cold, the hunger, the lack of sleep, these physical deprivations must exacerbate the pre-existing fractures. When Matt, perhaps portraying the quiet observer tired of being overlooked, finally finds a moment to act decisively for someone other than himself, this act should feel monumental precisely because it breaks his established pattern of deferral. The film needs to sell the exhaustion of constantly performing a certain role within the group. Survival becomes about shedding those roles. The subtle ways in which the actors portray the physical discomfort, the shivering that masks an attempt at control, the strained attempts at maintaining composure, will ground the unbelievable horror in relatable human suffering. Moreover, the theme of inherited consequence must be visually represented in the mountain itself. The miner's history, the initial prank, and the ensuing tragedy should feel like geological scars on the landscape. When the characters explore the abandoned mine shafts or the dilapidated structures, the set design must convey the weight of decades of unspoken suffering. If the filmmakers employ an actor known for playing characters grappling with overwhelming historical guilt, perhaps someone whose past roles involved confronting systemic injustice, that internalized pressure can translate into a profound, almost spiritual dread when confronting the ancient entity of the Wendigo. The creature shouldn't just kill, it should seem to judge, targeting those whose actions most closely mirror the past mistakes of the mountain's inhabitants. The transition from the grounded, human terror of the psycho threat to the full manifestation of the Wendigo must be a seamless escalation, not a jarring genre shift. The film should build toward the realization that the human antagonist was merely a pawn, perhaps even a victim himself, driven to desperation by the same environmental or psychological forces plaguing the 8 friends. The final confrontations should test the limits of physical endurance, emphasizing grueling, messy survival over stylized action sequences. The lingering silence after the final confrontation should be deafening, filled only with the sound of ragged breathing, leaving the audience with the haunting impression that escaping the mountain only means carrying the internalized monster, the memory of their failures, out into the wider world. The true test of the screenplay's maturity lies in its handling of the aftermath, the inevitable moments of quiet reflection that follow the climax of chaos. A lesser horror film would conclude with a triumphant escape or a definitive slaying of the beast. This adaptation, however, must embrace the lingering psychological devastation, suggesting that survival itself is a form of profound wounding. The final sequences, perhaps focusing on the solitary journey of the lone survivor, or survivors, should lean into ambiguity. Did they truly escape the mountain's influence, or have they merely been exiled, forced to carry the narrative of Blackwood Pines within them? The cinematography here must shift dramatically, the oppressive darkness of the forest replaced by the cold, unforgiving light of dawn, illuminating only the stark reality of what was lost, not celebrating what was saved. If Sam emerges as the unlikely final guardian, her composure in the post-horror aftermath must be brittle, masking a core of absolute brokenness. An actress capable of portraying quiet devastation, someone whose strength was forged through necessary cruelty, will be crucial. Her silence should speak volumes about the things she was forced to witness or enact, contrasting sharply with the forced, performative reassurances the outside world will demand. Similarly, if Mike survives through a series of impulsive, near-suicidal acts of protection, his final scenes should show him stripped of all bravado, perhaps unable to meet the gaze of rescue personnel, forever marked by the responsibility he briefly and violently shouldered. Furthermore, the film must address the fate of the external world's perception of the event. The inherent tragedy of these types of stories is the inability of outsiders to comprehend the sheer scale of the psychological trauma endured. Any rescue sequence should feel invasive and insufficient. The investigators or authorities arriving on the scene should be depicted as clumsy intruders, their clinical approach contrasting violently with the visceral, deeply personal horror the survivors experienced. This reinforces the ultimate theme: